Morning decisions. How about a creamy mocha frappuccino drink? Or sweet vanilla? Smooth caramel, maybe? Or a white chocolate mocha? Whichever you choose, delicious coffee awaits. Find Starbucks Frappuccino drinks wherever you buy your groceries.
Drink? Now, shall we begin? Hello. The Cambridge spy ring has cast a shadow over the British establishment since the exposure of Donald Maclean and Guy Burgess in 1951. Along with Kim Philby, Antonia, Blunt and John Cairncross, they give a vast amount of secrets to the Soviets, particularly during the Second World War when Stalin had allied with Hitler. Antonia Sr., author of a new book on the Cambridge Five, Stalin's Apostles, joins to discuss their treachery, who they really harmed, and whether there is any romantic notion to their espionage which was driven by ideology. Please do share the pod with friends and enemies, and if you Apple listeners out there want to leave a review, I'd be most grateful, and even more so if it's generous. But let's welcome Antonia into the club. Antonia, what a pleasure to have you on to talk about your first non-fiction book on the History Book Club podcast.
Ollie, I'm delighted to be on your podcast and to talk about my lovely book, which is very exciting. You've just received a copy, as we were talking about. I haven't seen the finished article yet.
Well, it's a very handsome book. It's nice and shiny and it's good. It's got all the main characters. So for listeners' sake, Antonia's new book is Stalin's Apostles, the Cambridge Five, and the Making of the Soviet Empire. So when I say that all the key characters are on the front cover, you've got, in order of defection or unveiling, Burgess, Maclean, Philby, Blunt and Cairncross. Have I got that right?
Cairncross and Blunt. But yeah.
Oh, Cairncross was exposed before Blunt.
Oh, no. Well, exposed. I was thinking about the confessions. Anyway, look, right. Never mind.
Yes.
Let's not.
Right, we're quibbling.
Quibbling.
And by the way, who am I to quibble with Antonia Senior? So this is a book of the Cambridge Five, but importantly, and I'd like to ask you about this really, is there have been other books about the Cambridge Five, but I know that you were very keen to write a kind of an account that hasn't really been done before about them, which is their sort of Sovietness, their sort of dedication and their impact on the Soviet Union.
I felt very strongly that the Cambridge Five had become a story about being English. It was a story about the British establishment, about posh boys betraying their posh friends and being protected by other posh boys. And that because of the way that it had been portrayed, particularly on film, but also a little bit in the books and in the literature, we had this impression that the main victim of the Cambridge Five's treachery was the establishment. It's like a heist on the British establishment. And because nobody's very keen on the establishment anymore, this is not a particularly bad thing. And that the other thing they did maybe was a failure of patriotism, but lots of people don't really think patriotism is a notion that's worth defending. And I wanted to write a book about who the actual victims of the Cambridge Five's treachery were. And what I found when I actually stripped away all of the mythology and all of the layers of stories that have grown up about them subsequent to their defections, etc. What I found when I went back to the sources and I looked very carefully at what they did and what Stalin wanted from them, most crucially, it became obvious to me that the victims of the the Cambridge Five's treachery was actually the people of Eastern and Central Europe, Because once you realize that Stalin's great strategic vision entailed the creation of a Bolshevik empire that stretched well beyond well beyond the borders of Russia, and this was a goal from that predated World War II, was held throughout World War II, and was came to fruition after World War II. That was what he wanted from them. That's what they were helping him to get. That's where the kind of meat of their treachery was most useful. And I just think, just constantly recircling the idea of, whether or not Guy Burgess wore a Reform Club tie, I'm just not that interested in. That what I wanted to get at is, who did they hurt? Why did they hurt them? And, what use were they to one of the most horrific totalitarian dictators the world has ever known?
Yes. Well, they do though have this upbringing that I mean that it's still important that they all came from very privileged backgrounds, did they not? And
Well, even this has been partly overdone. So privileged, yes. Aristocratic, no. So Richard Davenport Hines describes it as a mezzanine level, right? So they're not, they're sort of, I mean, they're sort of in between. So Donald Maclean's grandfather was a kind of peasant on the island of Tiree. It was his father who was the first person in the family to, go to university and have any money. So Donald Maclean was very much second generation. He looked the part, he spoke the part, he kind of, he could act the part, but actually he wasn't old British aristocracy at all. Anthony Blunt was the son of a clergyman. Kim Philby's father was a kind of sort of empire dwelling mad socialist who then becomes a fascist. John Cairncross came from a very humble family. Guy Burgess, maybe, slightly more of that sort of class that's maybe slightly disappeared, of people who were, of young men who were expected to go out to run the empire and kind of, die in a foreign field dreaming of England. These were these boys. They weren't destined to sit in the House of Lords or, anything like that. And actually, one thing that I found, one common denominator was actually quite a, certainly Maclean and Burgess came from left-leaning families. So their rebellion was not to go left to the disapproval of their families. It was to go harder left because their already left-leaning families gave them nowhere else to go, if that makes sense. So, even that's slightly overplayed. The Russians who recruited them didn't understand the British class system at all, and the nuances therein. And I think they would have been quite disappointed had they, for example, gone to the Philby family home in Acol Road in West Hampstead, where Philby recruited Donald Maclean. And, obviously now it's the type of house that you have to be a banker to buy because the whole of London's gone insane. But certainly back then, this is quite a humble, house. We're not talking about an entire wing for the staff at all. So yeah, they're privileged. Yes, they're not the aristocratic stuff of the Stalinist fantasies that they thought they were.
well, I guess then Cambridge is obviously they're known as the Cambridge Five. That's the subtitle for your book.
Yes.
It's the Cambridge Five, Cambridge University, and you, funnily enough, I think studied under. Is it studied intelligence? What's
Yes.
the module or what was it
So
called?
I did history at Cambridge, and it was Christopher Andrew had basically invented the discipline of intelligence history not long
Right.
before I got there, and he was running an undergraduate course on intelligence history, and I took that, and that was when I first became
Was
fascinated
that
by.
oversubscribed? Did you were you first? Did you have to? Was there a queue?
Well, the rumor was that he was a recruiter as well, so
Well, he probably was.
I
Is.
know, so I really wanted to get a tap on the shoulder, but I think the fact that I spent so much time sort of spilling other people's secrets and drinking beer and not actually writing the essays was probably why I never got the tap on the shoulder. So yeah,
I'm
I
interested in
disappointingly didn't.
Cambridge and like you're studying this subject,
Mm.
and Cambridge is basically the nursery for five of. I'm struggling to think of a more, maybe Klaus Fuchs, of any more spies more well known, infamous than the Cambridge Five. And so, is there a kind of awareness of the Cambridge being the sort of perfect petri dish type breeding ground for this kind of thing, or does
Do
it
you know,
all come from Philby because he recruited us?
there wasn't when I was there, and that was because I think each generation of students has its own sort of political flavour. Like, today's students are kind of obsessed with one sort of politics. And when I was there in the 90s, it was deliberately and studiously apolitical. Like if you were political, you were kind of a bit embarrassing.
Yes,
We
I
were,
recognise this. Yes,
yeah.
same at my university.
Yeah, it was the 90s. It was lad culture. It was, drinking pints and playing pool and like never and talking only in double layers of extended irony, never saying anything serious. And so what I actually felt was when I started doing the research for this book and I was studying, the atmosphere in Cambridge in the 1930s was I thought it was so, and I was doing that at a time when today's students have a particular culture as well that was spilling over into the news, and it seemed to me really fascinating how a kind of young person's culture could become so infectious and sort of dominating that it could kind of you know create a kind of vibe, I guess. And of course not everybody is, not everybody was like I was. Not everybody was sort of playing pool and drinking pints, and not everybody in the 1930s Cambridge was a communist. In fact, one of the really interesting things that I did, which actually I think didn't make it to the book, was there's this very famous um, Armistice Day march in the early 1930s where Guy Burgess and Donald Maclean get involved and they have fights with the boat club boys, and it's often portrayed as this very sort of seminal moment where all these communists were running rampage through Cambridge. And actually, when I went and looked at the newspaper reports from the time, what became obvious was there was a very, very, very small but very vocal group of students who were involved in radical politics. And actually, the most of across town there was a parade, and they had people dressed up. They had like somebody dressed up as Hitler, and everybody was throwing wet sponges at his head. But there was also someone dressed up as Stalin, and they were throwing wet sponges at his head. So the most of the students in the university were throwing sponges at both extremes of the political spectrum. Um, and we just hear more about the more kind of vocal radicalists, which I guess is similar to nowadays. We hear a lot from the students who make the most noise and kind of build the encampments or whatever, and not from the majority who just want to kind of get their head down and have a good time and, not be dicks.
Yeah. Okay. Dwelling on the five themselves then, and I
Yeah.
mean, I don't know whether their recruitment, because it sort of it does all come from Philby, and his rather formative years in Vienna are very important, aren't they? But I wondered, is this sort of a bit like, I think I asked Lawrence Rees, no Hitler, no Holocaust? Is this like no Philby, no Cambridge Five?
Um, n no war, no Cambridge Five, I would say more specifically, because
So
I
it all
think,
comes back to Hitler then.
yeah, everything's about Hitler. No, because basically, Kim Philby is recruited by Arnold Deutscher, who's a brilliant illegal who goes to Britain, and he does have this idea that he's going to recruit these Englishmen, and they're going to be who are young radicals, and there were lots of young radicals around. And the Cambridge Five were not the only ones recruited either. There were others, there were the couple at Oxford. This was not they were not the only candidates in town. But when Deutsch recruits Philby, he certainly has absolutely no idea how high up in the establishment Philby will rise. Philby then recruits Donald Maclean, and it is quite likely that Donald Maclean is going to do quite well because, unlike Philby, who failed the exams to get into the Foreign Office, Donald Maclean didn't. Donald Maclean got in. So he was in the Foreign Office. So, yes, it was quite likely that if he could carry off the persona of, Foreign Office um, young Turk that he would do quite well. Then Guy Burgess saw that Maclean and Philby had recanted their formerly passionate communism, got very suspicious, and badgered them until they told him what had happened. And that's how Burgess got recruited. And Burgess is such an unstable, batshit character that it's very unlikely that he would have got very that he was going to go places at the point that he's recruited. Anthony Blunt was always intended to stay in Cambridge and recruit other young men, which he did. And actually, Anthony Blunt has had a very free pass. He's actually a horrible groomer of young men. I mean, when he's 30, he's sitting in supervisions in Cambridge, a very respected, charming academic, convincing naive and stupid 19-year-old boys to spy for the Soviets. I mean, we would explicitly call that grooming these days. And then Cairncross again is recruited and he gets into the Foreign Office. It was, nobody really expected that much from Cairncross because nobody liked him. He was just a creepy, horrible, boring little man. So it's a great idea, but it is dependent on serendipity. It's dependent on these young men actually doing what they go on to do, which is rise up through the ranks of the British establishment to really great places and then feed stuff back to the Soviets. And the thing that matters in that is the outbreak of war, because it's the outbreak of war that massively causes an expansion in British intelligence. It's that which brings Anthony Blunt into MI5. It's that which brings Kim Philby into Secret Intelligence Service. It is that which gives Burgess his opening in a greatly expanded government, which, has to overlook his various foibles to sort of employ him because, there are only so many men around. It's the massive expansion of the secret state that becomes necessary as a result of the war, which catapults these men who might otherwise have been relatively obscure into positions of great utility to their Soviet handler, who got lucky, really.
But then I suppose that means that it's rather lazy to say that, oh, well, they went to Cambridge, it's the British establishment and class system. They were bound to end up where they were. You could have picked anyone. You could have, what's the expression? Thrown a cat and hit Cambridge at the time and hit someone who would rise up to the top. That's quite a lazy way of looking at it then.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if you look at Kim Philby in the sort of mid 1930s, he's not really going anywhere. He's a sort of freelance journalist. He doesn't know where to go. He's completely thrown by not getting into the Foreign Office. That's what, the government, that's what he thinks he's going to be doing. His father is increasingly mad and kind of causing him great embarrassment. Kim Philby's father actually stands as a fascist in the general election because he's such a violent and anti-Semite. And he, marries a sort of 14-year-old girl. I mean, it's horrific. So, Philby doesn't really know where he's going, and actually quite a lot of the work of his early handlers is kind of giving him pep talks and saying, look, it's going to be all right. We'll figure something out for you. They take him to Austin Reed, the men's outfitters, and buy him a sharp suit. So he feels a bit better about, because he's broke as well. So he feels a bit better about kind of trying to inveigle his way upwards. Cairncross, they buy for him membership of the Travellers Club, which is the kind of big Foreign Office kind of club where they hang out. They buy him new suits. They get him a new flat because his existing flat is a bit, pathetic. So, the Soviet intelligence understands that these boys that they've recruited not only need, direction in how to be a Soviet agent and not get caught, they also need direction in how to move up within the British establishment in order to be useful. So it's not necessarily a done deal at all. I mean, Maclean, as I say, probably is the only one who is on a kind of upward trajectory from the moment he leaves Cambridge. The others, it's not quite so clear cut, I would say. But yeah, it's not. It's what it certainly wasn't a kind of surefire hit right from the get-go. No.
When you were writing about this, was there any of the five? Were there any of the five that you thought that you had more sympathy for than than is this sort of? I guess. Well, growing up, when I was young and stupid, I think I thought, oh gosh, it's so romantic what they did. I don't think that now, of course. But are there any of the five that you have a little bit more sympathy for than the other? I mean, Philby, I think it's difficult to because he seems so ruthless and willing to throw almost anyone under the bus for his own preservation. But are there any of the five?
Ollie, I have no sympathy for any of them. I think they're
Right.
horrific human beings. The other myth that I didn't necessarily set out to bust, it busted itself when I did the research, was this idea that they were ideologues in the 1930s when it wasn't possible to know anything about Stalin. And what became obvious to me was there was so much information coming out of the Soviet Union in the 1930s about the, dekulakization, about the effects of the rapid industrialization, about the famines, about the terror, and it didn't touch the sides of their belief. I go into a lot of detail about the ideology and why it didn't touch the sides of their belief, but you know so some of this information might have wasn't as readily available as it became in the 50s. So what happens is, of course, that Stalin becomes our ally during the war. We work very hard through our propaganda to whitewash his record, and then in the 50s we rediscover all his crimes as if they're new things, but they weren't new. We knew about them in the 30s. It's just
But
we
he was
hadn't
Uncle
forgotten.
Joe during the war,
He
so
was Uncle Joe during the war.
yeah.
But so it would have been possible, I think, in the 30s for your average person in the street who's more interested in playing pool and drinking pints not to know that much about what was going on in the Soviet Union. There was, however, so much out there that I think if you've decided to spy on a country's behalf, it's rather incumbent upon you to do a little tiny weeny bit of research into what that country is actually like. So, I think the bit that people forget is that for ideological revolutionaries like the Cambridge Five, the blood and the misery was not incidental. It was the whole point. The blood is cleansing. The blood is the whole point of the revolution. It's that you have to break everything down before you can remake it, right? So they knew exactly how problematic the regime was that they were committing themselves to spy for. They just didn't care because they had a vision in their head of what they were trying to achieve, and they didn't let facts tarnish that vision. I mean, both Blunt and Burgess went to Moscow in the 1930s. Blunt didn't even bother going to any of on the stupid factory visits that were laid on by their minders. He just wandered around the Hermitage, kind of, swooning over paintings. And Burgess was just trying to sleep with all the minders and didn't really care either. So neither, they don't care that it's horrible. And I found a fantastic piece of research by Sheila Fitzpatrick, the great Soviet historian, who looked at the agency called Vox or Vox, VOKS, was kind of the Soviets agency which accompanied foreign visitors around the Soviet Union in the 1930s. And they were constantly astonished that in those kind of young radicals who went over to visit in the 1930s, the ones who were most disappointed by the fact that the revolution was ugly and horrible and vicious were the ones who went home and wrote the most laudatory pieces about it. Because, you don't want the proletariat you don't want the plebs to understand that it's going to be quite messy, but it's going to be okay because, the narcissism of communist revolutionaries is always, when I lead the revolution, it's going to be fantastic. So I'm not going to bother the plebeian heads with the trivial details that it might be quite messy on the way. So yeah, I entirely punctured within my own head, and I hope within the heads of people who read my books, the idea that they were apple-cheeked, ideologues who were misled by the nasty Soviets. They knew what they were doing and they did it willingly.
With Blunt, and it's a really um, interesting image you give of him wandering around Moscow art galleries. Because and this is with Philby who love cricket, and you get an impression that it's fine for me to sit at Lord's watching England, you know, lose to Australia presumably, and 1948, and but that's fine because I'm eating my cucumber sandwich and I'm comfortable. I don't have to live as a Soviet. The irony being, in the end, he had to and didn't enjoy it. But is
Ollie,
it?
I think the underlying this question is your prejudice that people who like cricket can't be bad.
Yeah,
I'm gonna have to.
I just refuse to believe it. He can't be all bad.
He's all bad. Listen, I tell you one way of knowing how bad, and we're skipping a little bit ahead in the story here,
But it suggests to me like an arrogance in that they're quite happy to enjoy the delights of capitalism, because cricket is not a sport that would ever be invented and certainly has not thrived in Russia, Soviet Union or Russia.
Yeah, I mean, of course. I mean, they sit around drinking pink gin and having a marvelous time, and of course, that it's impossible not to see the hypocrisy of the way that they live their lives. I mean, there's a wonderful Malcolm Muggeridge wrote this book about the 1930s, and he sort of he was a reformed leftist, and he wrote about the kind of craze for being a communist amongst well-heeled young people, and he talks about the kind of daughters coming into their fathers and declaring passionately in front of the maids that they were now revolutionaries. The fathers like raising their eyes like, oh God. So yeah, of course it's absurd. It's completely absurd, but none of that bothered them. They were ideologically committed in a way I think it's quite hard to understand now. I mean, I suppose, well, it's less hard to understand now than it was in the 90s, because I see people who are ideologically committed to things that don't make sense all the time. But yeah, I mean, one of the things that also doesn't make sense is you say cricket wouldn't be invented in the kind of utopian heaven that is communism. What is the utopian heaven that they were working towards? Nobody ever can define it. I think, as one was it Arthur Koestler maybe was like, it's the radiant vision that you can't quite raise your eyes to. You can't look at it and define it and say what it looks like. You just will know it when you get there. It's just, oh, lo and behold, nobody ever bloody gets there. And then the fact that you can't get there is never the fault of the idea. It's never the fault of the vision. It's the fault of, counter-revolutionaries or whatever it is. It's always someone else's fault, why the vision always just recedes. It always reminds me of, when you're sort of by the seaside and the moon is like shining on the water, and if you kind of try and walk on the path of the moon, it always recedes and you can never get there. It's like that. And it's just kind of, you would hope that most people on reaching the age of 25 would understand that you're never going to reach the bloody moon, but these guys didn't. And quite often that is shown as a kind of that is described as something admirable, right? So Philby himself in his memoir says, that unlike Koestler and Muggeridge, who I've mentioned, he didn't turn his back on the ideology, even when he saw things wrong with it. He says, I stayed the course, as if that's admirable, not like pathetic, not like, that if you reach a certain age and realize that you're never going to get to the moon, you can change your mind. Right. Yeah.
So is it then an addiction to secrecy then that drives them, do you think? They loved the fact that they knew that they were spies and they were spying and others didn't.
So there's one really, really, really interesting moment, I think, in their story, which is when the terror happens, most of their handlers get disappear, right? And they know where they've gone. They've gone back to Russia, and most of them have been bumped off. So they're without handlers, and then um, Stalin becomes Hitler's ally, effectively. Now, a number of people who were involved in spying for the Soviets took this opportunity of chaos and ideological, what looks like an ideological backtrack from Stalin, to back away, right? To walk off, to disappear, to not spy anymore, right? But the Cambridge Five double down. Philby works really hard to get his information to Moscow in this period. They don't even particularly want it. They're not that interested in him at this point. You know, they push and push at a door that has closed upon them, and they're so determined to remain as servants to the revolution. So is that a devotion to secrecy? Is it ideology? Or is it most likely both? It's these are ideologically committed men who are also enjoying the um the kind of the game, the bluff and double bluff of it all, the kind of slight nastiness of it all, the shabbiness of it all, the kind of poking around in dark corners of it all. So yeah, I think they love it. And I think so they're committed to it both emotionally and ideologically and because of their personalities. So it's a kind of toxic mix. I mean, that's certainly true for Philby and Blunt, to a certain extent to Burgess. Cairncross and Maclean are slightly harder to get a handle on, but yeah, I'd say probably them too.
Well, it's really interesting is the with Burgess and Maclean defecting in 52,
51.
51. Thank you. And I think Maclean is the one who's exposed, or is about to be exposed, but Burgess makes this kind of snap decision. So, and I know I should note this exhaustive research in this, and I can tell, you've been trawling through the archives at Kew, and so the actual defection, Burgess and Maclean, is Burgess is this the snap decision that one has always thought it was, or
This is quite a difficult question, actually, Ollie, because there's various possibilities. So, one is that he was okay, rather than go through them all, this is what I think is most likely. And as you say, I have done exhaustive research, which I loved and would do all over again. It was just brilliant. But what I think happened, so when Maclean is being watched and followed by MI5 in the month before his defection, he is obviously broken. And we know this both from the MI5 watchers, we know this from the subsequent testimony of Blunt, and we know this from various places. He's basically an alcoholic, wibbly mess. He's absolutely on his knees. He is being encouraged to flee. He's being told it's his only option. His wife, Melinda, is pregnant, although I found out in the course of research it probably wasn't even his. Melinda's pregnant. He's, in pieces. And I think what happens is that the Soviets basically want Burgess to go with him as a minder because he hasn't got the chops to do it himself. And it's Burgess who hires the car, and it's Burgess who books the tickets, and it's Burgess who actually sort of organise it. And Burgess is himself an alcoholic mess at this point with a codeine addiction. And their handler at the time, Yuri Mosin, is also, involved helping them out. But I think there is maybe some idea at this point, because it's all a bit panicky, that Burgess can get him to a certain point and then come back. What we're never quite clear on is whether or not Burgess intended to go all the way to Moscow, or whether he intended to sort of get Maclean across the channel and then creep back. At what point did that not become a possibility? And that I don't think we're entirely sure. So Burgess goes too, and he kind of expects to be welcomed with open arms, and then Burgess has a pretty miserable time. One of the fascinating things, this is sort of again slightly leaping forward, is that Burgess tries to come home in the mid 1950s, and MI5 and others basically totally panic. And the reason they panic is because even though the fact of his defection means that everybody knows Guy Burgess is a spy, they have no proof, and no proof that they can use in court without exposing, some of the greatest secrets of the war, like the Venona program that exposed Donald Maclean. So they basically panic because they're like, he's going to come back. Unless he confesses, we can't put him on trial. And then everybody will think that we're completely weak and hopeless because we've let Guy Burgess come home and just let him go free. So they're in this bind. So they get Anthony Blunt, who hasn't spoken to Burgess since his defection, because Burgess's defection puts Blunt and Philby in a very difficult position. And Blunt writes to Burgess in Moscow and says, listen, you've got no idea how much trouble and hassle you've caused all of us. You're just a nightmare. Do not come home. Do not come home. So poor old Burgess, poor old Burgess, he's an awful man. But Burgess, dies miserable and missing England in Moscow years later.
Oh,
Anyway,
did you watch the Alan Bennett drama of Burgess in Moscow? An Englishman Abroad?
yes. And I also watched, one of the formative things I watched was that one about Burgess as a young man, Another Country, although
Yes,
he was
with
lightly
Rupert Everett.
fictionalized. Yeah, and it was these kind of depictions of him that I just found, we're supposed to sympathize. And then later in his life, he becomes this sort of like slightly sad tourist attraction for leftists who visit Moscow and they all want to go and hang out with Guy
Yeah,
Burgess
and they
who
go and buy
sits
him
there.
pajamas to keep him happy in
Yeah, and it's
pajamas
all
from
just,
Jermyn Street. And
yeah, exactly, and it's all just so tawdry and yeah, I it, I'm glad he had a miserable old age, to be honest.
yes, there seems to be it's more as though he sort of committed some terrible social faux pas, but other than that, he's a good chap, really.
Well, what reading, a lot of this didn't get into the book because there's just too much to get into the book. But reading a lot of the interviews with his friends and so the MI5 were trying to get Anthony Blunt for years after the defection, and he was being bugged and listened to, and then he started kind of working for them too. So he was informing on people, and he was being bugged, and his conversations with people were being bugged. And there's like various points where some of their kind of leftist friends were sort of, dear old guy, poor dear guy, oh dear guy, he's having a terrible time, and then anybody who talked to MI5 was like beyond the pale because, oh, we've got to protect poor dear guy, and you can read this like, and it's all through the 50s and onwards, is this sort of amongst this kind of circle of people who found England to be a terrible bore and the empire to be terribly embarrassing. um he was kind of, not a hero, that's too strong, but certainly someone who didn't deserve too much opprobrium.
But they did deserve it because I think you've done a huge amount of work on. I mean, there's the famous operation in Albania that. I mean, this is really where blood is on the hands of Philby.
Yeah, so my contention in the book is that like they were all very useful to the Soviets in the building of the empire, um in the sense that, Maclean and Burgess were very helpful with the kind of the way that Stalin had to do diplomatic maneuvering to kind of um, cement his hold. Philby's because Philby was running Soviet counter espionage in the post-war period. The blood on his hands is more sort of obvious. It's more direct. You can trace a direct line between Philby and the deaths of people who were, trying to carve a little bit of independence out of the mess and the devastation of World War Europe. So there's, I mean, I did lots of work in the Lithuanian archives and the Albanian archives and the CIA archives and other bits of American intelligence, which were really helpful because the British records are rubbish, obviously, because we're not allowed into SIS records. So,
It's
it's
terrible, isn't it? It's really.
hopeless. Yeah, but what's ridiculous is so there's one particular Ukrainian mission that I opened the book with, and actually the way I got to that was because it's a British-led mission, all led by SIS, but because British and American intelligence is cooperating on the Ukrainian stuff at that point through Kim Philby, um, the SIS is debriefing the Americans in some detail on their missions so that the Americans can learn lessons for their own missions. So we have all the SIS briefings in the CIA archives for some of the missions that Philby is directly responsible for betraying. So, for example, right at the end of right in May 1951, just before Burgess and Maclean are about to abscond, Philby writes later in his memoir that his sort of last act before the suspicion fell on him too heavily and he couldn't really do anything anymore. His last act was the betrayal of some missions into Ukraine, and he says in his memoir, I don't know what happened to those involved, but I can make an educated guess, right? It's very blasé, it's very, very cold. Anyway, rather beautifully, and I kind of did squeal a little bit when I found it. I found those missions that he betrayed. I found them in the CIA files, complete chapter and verse on what happened to those Ukrainian men that were sent into the Soviet Union in May 1951. And it is slightly complicated by the fact that the British recruited their Ukrainian partisans from within the ranks of the so-called Galicia Division, which was a Waffen SS division that was formed in 1943 in Ukraine. So they were Banderites. They followed Stefan Bandera. They were implicated in fascist war crimes, right? So these are not all nice people, right? So it's not, you don't get to go, oh, it's all good versus bad, whatever. But I found the histories of the 16 men that were sent across into Ukraine in May 1951, and some of them were really, really young. Like one of them was 12 years old when the Galicia Division was created. One of them was 14 years old when the Galicia Division was created. There was no way you can implicate these boys in the crimes of Stefan Bandera. But, we can't know how guilty or innocent these men were. But then, crucially, neither could Philby, and he didn't care. So, I mean, sorry, Ollie, I'm talking a lot, but do you want to know what happened to the 16 Ukrainians who were sent in
Well,
May
I think
1951?
I think we
You
can
can
make an
imagine.
educated guess,
Yeah. Yeah.
like Philby, and so this is this is the real comes to the nub of it, really. They were willing to hurl whoever they wanted to their deaths. It really was irrelevant to them.
Yeah, absolutely. And, Philby is the one of the worst, is held up, but the others were no better than Philby. I mean, one of the things I discovered during my research is how implicated Anthony Blunt was in basically hobbling the effectiveness of the Polish government in exile in talking to their operatives in the field towards the end of the war, because um, you've got to remember what it was like for the Poles. They'd been invaded from both sides in 1939. They'd desperately been clinging on to the idea that after everything was over, they might be able to have, go back to the pre-war position where they had their own country. And they can watch the Red Army advancing through Poland in 1944. And they and it's a horrible time and they're trying to maneuver and they're trying to do what they can. And in the meantime, the person in charge of British intelligence's mission to understand how they communicate with their people in the field is Anthony Blunt, which effectively means he has access to all their communications. And then there's a couple of Polish historians I've read who say that it is kind of extraordinary how quickly the Polish secret police, the communist and Soviet secret police in the kind of ending months of the war, are able to round up the last remnants of anti-Nazi resistance who become targeted by the Soviets. And part of the reason is that all their lines of communication have been compromised by Anthony Blunt.
Well, this has been fantastic, Antonia. It really has. Thanks so much. And so the book, I think, is out on the 9th of April.
It is.
This podcast is going out on the Monday following.
Okay.
Don't make me work out what that is. But it's in all good bookshops and less good ones as well. So, Antonia, thank you very much and best of luck with the book.
Thank you so much, Ollie. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. Sorry if my indignation got too feverish at any points.
Well, no, I mean that's the main thrust of the book. So it's, I think, one of those ones where when you actually do the research like you have, and you basically it's a bit of myth busting.
It is.
Good stuff.
Thanks, Ollie.
We've come to the end of this club meeting, so thank you for listening. If you want to get in touch about club benefits, please do, either by email or on X or Instagram. Links are in the show notes. I've also included my Substack link so members can read articles I've written on various matters that may be of interest. The History Book Club is written and presented by me, Oliver Webb-Carter. Music is by listener Chat DMZ. Episodes continue next week and every week, so please do join, subscribe, and if you can provide the club with a 5-star rating, we would be delighted. In the meantime, I thank you again, and now I have to usher members out into the real world. Until next time.
Been out here all morning. Not a single bite. Guess the fish finally figured it out. Just like hackers do when Cisco Duo's on guard. With Duo's end-to-end phishing resistance, every login, every device, every user stays protected. No hooks, no catches, no bites. Cisco Duo. Phishing season is over. Learn more at duo.com.